If you've seen my video on the poem La Belle d'un Sans Merci, then you'll know that I'm a bit of a Keats fan. And even though for some reason the Eve of St Agnes is not regarded as one of Keats's finest narrative poems, I love this one too. The poem was written in 1819 and Keats was influenced by a range of different sources, from the freezing battlements of Shakespeare's Hamlet to the warring families whose children fall in love in Romeo and Juliet, to the faux medieval setting created by Horace Walpole in the Castle of Otranto, which, if you haven't read, by the way, is well worth a £2.50 purchase from Amazon, not only because if you're a literature fan, it weirdly bridges the gap between the old genre of plays and the newfound genre of novels, but also because, as a novel, it's credited with beginning the Gothic genre, and loads of other stories were influenced by it. And when you first look at this poem, it's quite understandable to feel a bit anxious, and let's face it, there's no getting away from the fact that this is a narrative poem which is probably a lot longer than most others that you may have read before, but please don't let that put you off. The story itself is fairly straightforward, and the language is beautifully rich and sensual. So, let's start off with a bit of historical context. The original St Agnes, upon whom the legend was formed, was a teenager who lived around the year 300 AD, and she became a martyr after she refused a Roman's hand in marriage because, she said, she was already married to Jesus. As a result of this, she was sentenced to death. But at the time, the law did not permit virgins to be executed, so she was dragged naked through the streets to a brothel. It's said that because of her purity, the men who sought her services in the brothel were all struck blind. The plot of Keats's poem centres around the myth which surrounds this saint, that on the night of the 20th of January, if a virgin girl goes to bed without supper, undresses herself so that she is completely naked and lies on her bed with her hands under the pillow and looks up to the heavens, then her future husband will appear in her dreams, kiss her, and feast with her. The lovers in Keats's poem are Madeline and Porphyro, and the pair are denied access to one another on account of their families, who, in the style of Romeo and Juliet, hate each other. Madeline is the young female virgin youth who romantically believes in the legend of St Agnes, and so, step by step, performs the rites on the allotted night. Porphyro is the daring male youth who sneaks into the castle on the pretext of seeing his love, which may or may not be as innocent as it sounds, but who later learns of the St Agnes ritual which Madeline is about to perform and decides, rather than leaving matters to chance, to make sure that it is he who Madeline sees as her future husband. The poem centres around a series of oppositions, and one of the most important is dreams and reality. Madeline, in performing the ritual in the hope that she will dream of Porphyro, that he will appear before her in reality. Other oppositions, age and youth, silence and noise, death and vitality, and the one which really begins the poem, heat and cold. St Agnes Eve. Ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped, trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Numb were the beadsman's fingers while he told his rosary, and while his frosted breath, like pious incense from a century old, seemed taking flight for heaven without a death, past the sweet Virgin's picture, while his prayer he saith, this patient holy man. Then takes his lamp, and writheth from his knees, and back returneth, meagre, barefoot, wan, along the chapel aisle by slow degrees. The sculptured dead on either side seem to freeze, imprisoned in black purgatorial rails. Knights, ladies, praying in dumb oratories he passeth by, and his weak spirit fails to think how they may ache in icy hoods and mails. The beginning of the poem is set in an empty chapel in winter, and so the opening is chock full of images of freezing cold, from the owl who is cold despite all of its feathers, to the hare trembling through the frozen grass, and the flock of sheep who are silent despite their woolly coats. The only human life here is a beadsman, and this is someone who is very poor, and in this case an old man, who is paid for praying for another person's soul. The beadsman's fingers are numb with cold, and his prayers are described using the poem's first simile, which compares his frosted breath to the smoke from a censer, which I've got a picture of here. The beadsman's age and closeness to death are suggested through this image too, as the smoke from the burning incense is released, like a soul taking flight for heaven. The beadsman's piety and poor condition are further emphasised in stanza 2 through the adjectives meagre, barefoot and wan. Barefoot despite the bitter cold, and wan which means pale, feeble and sickly. The line which I'm highlighting here seems to suggest that it's so cold even the statues, the sculptured dead in the chapel, are freezing. And it's also worth pointing out those oppositions I mentioned just now, that death will soon be contrasted with youthful vitality in the same way that the casting of the statues in positions of silent prayer will contrast with the noise and energy of festivities in the castle above. Now, it's probably worth, before we go any further, to quickly mention the structure of the stanzas in this poem. Each stanza is 9 lines long, with 8 of those lines written in what is called iambic pentameter, which I've tried to illustrate for you here. Each line has 10 syllables, and the stress of each line falls on every other syllable, which means that it's almost unconsciously emphasised. And you can see here how that draws our attention to the most important words in this line: prayer, saith, patient and holy, which highlight the positive qualities of the beadsman. And this pattern is used for 8 out of the 9 lines of each stanza, but in the 9th line the structure changes. The 9th line of each stanza has a structure called an alexandrine, which is still an iambic line, so every other syllable is stressed, but it's got 12 syllables instead of 10, and particular emphasis falls on the 6th syllable. And you can see how this applies in the example I've chosen from the 2nd stanza, where the word ache in the 6th syllable in the line, and therefore emphasises the frozen conditions. It is, of course, significant, therefore, that the beadsman turns north, symbolically towards the cold and death. And after only a few steps, he hears the sounds of celebration beginning upstairs. At first, he appears moved to tears by the sounds of the music before accepting exclusion from these events, recognising that his death bell had already rung. Therefore, another way he went, to sit among ashes and pray all night for the souls of sinners. And ashes are always significant in literature texts. If you've read them, then think about Paradise Lost, or the first and last chapters of Mice and Men, the Valley of Ashes in The Great Gatsby, or the mountain in Lord of the Flies. Ashes have negative connotations of waste and sin and death and hopelessness, and here Keats is attributing these concepts to the beadsman whose life will soon be over. The fact that there is a feast or celebration beginning in the castle above the chapel is suggested by the word prelude, which is used to introduce the sound of the trumpets which the beadsman hears, because so many of the castle doors are wide open due to the hustle and bustle of the party preparations. The adjective snarling is an interesting one to describe the trumpets, as it clearly contributes to the negative impression we will form of the inhabitants of this castle. There is also sibilance, which is where the S sound is repeated, as in silver snarling, and this is sometimes suggestive of things evil, sinister and malevolent, and will contrast with the descriptions of music later on in the poem. The only other things to point out here are the descriptions of the crests of carved angels, the cornices and wings, which create the European medieval setting of the poem and so adds to the Gothic feeling of the piece. And the use of the word glowing here, which is the first indication of the warmth which exists above the chapel and will contrast with the beadsman's plight below. In stanza 5, there's a sudden injection of pace and energy which Keats creates through the description of the arrival of the guests at the castle, who burst in with rich array of clothing suitable for a pageant. We've got tiaras and plumes of feathers. Notice how the tone of the poem has changed to the present through the use of the verbs burst and haunting, which gives the stanza an energy and immediacy which contrasts with what has come before. We also have youth mentioned for the first time, which sets up one of the most significant oppositions in the poem, youth and age. The stanza is structured in two quite clear halves, separated by the caesura. Here, the first half describes the arrival of the party guests to the castle, while in the second half we are directed by Keats to wish or imagine all these guests away, so that we turn all our attention to one lady there. This lady is Madeline, who has been waiting all day to perform the ritual of St Agnes, which she has heard, almost as old wives' tales passed down through the generations. And in the following stanza we're told what this ritual involves. Young girls, virgins such as Madeline, must go to bed without eating and not look around at all. Once in bed, she must couch supine, which means to lie on her back, facing upwards as if gazing towards heaven, and pray for all that they desire. If this ritual is performed correctly on the Eve of St Agnes, then girls will have a dream, a vision of their future husbands. Madeline is clearly treating this process very seriously. She's so focused on the ritual that she barely hears the music of the party at all, and with her eyes fixed on the floor she sees little except the sweeping trains of the dresses as the guests pass by her. Despite this, we are told that Madeline attracts the attention of many suitors, these amorous cavaliers, who tiptoe cautiously up to Madeline, trying to get her attention, but she treats them with disdain, as if they are not worthy of her. Notice, though, how this treatment does not cool their desires, and we see here how the youth of this poem are linked to the heat of passion. This stanza is quite a good example of how Keats uses the Alexandrine structure in the final line of each stanza. Remember that an Alexandrine is a 12-syllable iambic line, so every other syllable is stressed, but the sixth syllable is where the main stress and so focal point lies. In this example, it's the word dreams. And this is because it is the dream that Madeline is hoping to have that night which is taking up all of her attention. It's also one of the first places where the opposition between dreams and reality is introduced to the poem, and more about that in a moment. In stanza 8, we see that time has moved on by several hours. The hallowed hour is now near at hand. In other words, the time when Madeline will retire to her bedroom. And she's becoming excited by this. Her breathing is quick and short, but there is also a nervousness which begins this and the following stanza, shown here by the word anxious. The mood of the other partygoers is also mentioned, with sounds of sport mixed in with sounds of anger and looks of love, combined with defiance, hate and scorn. And Keats does not depict the members of this household in particularly positive terms, and in fact the descriptions become more negative as the poem continues. And amidst all of this is Madeline, whose eyes are described as vague and regardless, literally not looking at anything going on around her, because she has been hoodwinked with fairy fancy. And the use of the word hoodwinked is really interesting. It can simply mean tricked, but more specifically, it's a term in falconry, where a hood is put over the bird's head to stop it getting distracted. So this is not only suggests that Madeline is deceiving herself by taking part in the legend of St Agnes, and that she's been tricked by the magical properties that the ritual is meant to possess, but also that she will be unable to see anything except the visions she expects to have that night. This is then followed in the next line by the word lamb, which is often used in literature to suggest innocence and sacrifice. Well, her innocence is easy enough to pinpoint, but exactly what it is that Madeline will sacrifice is only hinted at towards the end of the poem. Now, as I just mentioned, this stanza begins like the one before, with a sense of Madeline's nervousness, and we can tell this because despite each moment intending to retire to bed, she doesn't. She continues to linger downstairs. Keats now performs a dramatic shift in setting, and this is indicated by the caesura here in the middle of the line. The shift is from the scene of the party inside the castle to outside, where the second of our young lovers is introduced. This is Porphyro. And in keeping with the images of heat associated with youth in this poem, he is described as having a heart on fire for Madeline. He has travelled across the moors to the castle and is now praying to the saints that he might catch a glimpse of her. This stanza includes the first of 8 references to the moon in this poem, and along with this being part of the Gothic context of the poem, in literature the moon is also associated with Diana, goddess of women, femininity and sexuality. And notice how quickly Porphyro's original plan to worship her unseen changes in the last 2 lines of the poem, and how his feelings become increasingly impassioned, unrestrained and physical as he imagines speaking to her and possibly even touching and kissing her. And so, another of the poem's oppositions is established, that of dreams and reality. In stanza 6, Madeline hopes that by performing the St Agnes ritual, she will experience a vision of her lover, whereas Porphyro wants to gaze at the actual form of Madeline and maybe enjoy a physical connection between them. And this is one of the underlying questions which we'll be left with at the end of the poem. Exactly how innocent are Porphyro's intentions? In stanza 10, Porphyro manages to gain access to the castle, and it's here that we learn just how dangerous this enterprise is. Remember what I said at the start about the hints of Romeo and Juliet which permeate the narrative? Well, there are two warring families here who hate each other, but their children have fallen in love. And just like in Shakespeare's play, there is a party which the young male lover gatecrashes and, if discovered, risks death. The threat of violence is indicated by the description of the guests at the party, who are now barbarians, hyenas, and hot-blooded lords. For him, the castle is foul, and the residents would storm his heart with 100 swords if they found him. The only hope for a meeting between Porphyro and Madeline lies with one old beldame, so old woman, weak in body and mind, who's also reminiscent of the nurse in Shakespeare's story, and her name is Angela. And as chance would have it, in the very next stanza she appears very close to where Porphyro has hidden himself. Her age is suggested by her shuffling walk and palsied hand, which suggests a kind of paralysis, which is the complete opposite of the daring, energetic, youthful vitality of Porphyro. Angela is a confusing character. She appears to be an old family retainer and yet clearly sides with Porphyro, who is a sworn enemy of the family. Some of her description also raises questions, such as why is her cane described as a wand, and why elsewhere in the poem is she described using the word crone, which, along with meaning ugly old woman, is also a stock character from fairy stories, often with malicious intentions and having some supernatural qualities. She makes references to other magical and supernatural ideas in a few stanzas' time. But for now, let's just focus on her as the second old character that's been introduced to the poem, along with the beadsman at the start, and the two of them together create an image of life very close to death. Porphyro reveals himself to Angela, and at first she is startled before recognising him and grasping his hand. Now we have the first use of direct speech, as Angela warns him to get away. Notice that despite living and working in the castle, she still describes the residents as a bloodthirsty race, which indicates her sympathies are certainly with Porphyro. Her idiolect includes colloquial expressions such as mercy to express surprise, repetition such as get hence, and archaic vocabulary which we'll see in a couple of stanzas' time. And this, along with Porphyro's address to her in the next stanza as gossip dear, suggests a person of a lower class, perhaps lacking education with slightly provincial manners. From Angela, we get more descriptive details about a couple of the residents of the castle. There's someone called Hildebrand, who is described using the unflattering adjective dwarfish, who in a feverish fit had cursed Porphyro, his family, and his land. There is also old Lord Morris, whose age and grey hairs haven't cooled his temper, and she repeats her entreaties to Porphyro for him to flit like a ghost away. Compared to Angela, and despite her warnings, Porphyro seems pretty relaxed about the perceived dangers and invites Angela to sit down in an armchair, and is halfway through asking her how he may catch a glimpse of Madeline when he's interrupted by a panicked exclamation from Angela, "Good saints, not here, not here." and she ushers Porphyro into a neighbouring room, fearing that if they stay he will be killed upon the flagstones. Porphyro now finds himself in a little moonlit room, and this is the second reference to moonlight in the poem, which, along with the use of other adjectives used to describe the room and the simile silent as a tomb, place this setting firmly within the Gothic genre. Another perhaps less significant opposition is present here as well, as Porphyro follows Angela through a lowly arched way, which, together with the description of dwarfish Hildebrand of the previous stanza, contrast with Porphyro's lofty plume. In this more secure environment, Porphyro is able to ask Angela where he might find Madeline, and in doing so makes accidental reference to St Agnes. Angela picks him up on this in stanza 14, and it's here that we see more evidence of the mergence between fantasy and reality through the references to fairy stories and supernatural abilities which I mentioned just now. Angela is amazed at Porphyro's ability to get into the castle undetected, and conveys this by saying that it must have been as impossible as holding water in a witch's sieve, and that Porphyro must be lord of all the elves and fairies to have been able to achieve it. These associations with Porphyro and some sort of magical enchanter help some critics to build a case that Porphyro's intentions in seeing Madeline are far from innocent, and Angela laughs at the end of this stanza at the amazement of Madeline's Agnes Eve conjuring and Porphyro's sudden, almost magical appearance. The first 5 lines of the next stanza describe Porphyro's confusion as Angela sits in a chimney nook and laughs feebly at the situation. The contrast between youth and age is signalled again through the description of Porphyro as a puzzled urchin and Angela as an aged crone. And again, the choice of these words is interesting, as urchin can suggest mischievousness in youth, in the same way that crone suggests witch, which I mentioned just now. But Porphyro is brought close to tears as he is told about Madeline's purpose in hoping to have a vision of her future husband through the legend of the St Agnes ritual. There's quite a lot of sexually suggestive language in the next 3 lines, as Porphyro realises how he can use this situation to his advantage. We don't actually find out what his stratagem is until stanza 19, and the idea has apparently come to him suddenly, although this is the second time the word stratagem has been used, and this certainly hints towards something more carefully planned out. He claims in the next stanza that he will not harm her or displace one hair on her head, but the thought that comes to him like a full-blown rose, flushing his brow and making purple riot, is almost overtly sexual in its imagery and hints towards a deliberate and planned seduction of Madeline. Upon hearing the plan, Angela is at first shocked. She calls him cruel, wicked, and in the final line of the stanza she tells Porphyro that he is not the honourable person she believed he was, which chimes in with the theme of appearance and reality evidenced elsewhere in the poem. So it seems that Angela knows even at this stage what Porphyro's intentions are, which makes it all the stranger why she agrees to help him 17 lines later. Between then and now, Porphyro aims to convince Angela that he will do Madeline no harm. Firstly, by making this promise to all the saints, then by saying how he will never find forgiveness in heaven after death if he moves one hair from her head. He then lets out some impassioned tears before saying at the end of the stanza that if Angela doesn't believe him, he will raise his voice to the point where he will be overheard and discovered by the rest of the household. We can even imagine Porphyro raising his voice as he says this, so that at the beginning of the next stanza, a terrified Angela reminds Porphyro of her own aged, fragile state, and that such shocks could easily end her life. We can see that Angela, like the beadsman at the start of the poem, is very close to death. She's described as feeble, poor, weak, and palsy-stricken, as well as a churchyard thing. A passing bell is a bell which is rung following someone's death and signals the start of mourning and prayer. Angela says that her passing bell may be rung for her that very night. Such is her condition. Having spoken these words to him, Porphyro speaks more gently to her. What he says is never reported, but we know that his words are woeful and of such deep sorrowing that Angela promises that she will do whatever he shall wish. And these final 6 syllables here translate as, whatever may happen, whether it's good or bad. Now we get the account of what it is that Porphyro claims his intentions are, and this perhaps helps to explain why Angela was so distressed in the second half of stanza 16. His plan is to be led by Angela to Madeline's bedroom, and once there, to hide and look at her without being noticed. Angela herself appears to add to this plan in the next stanza, as she said that food is stored in this closet. And remember that in the original St Agnes legend, the husband will appear in a vision and the lovers will feast together. For Madeline's part, she will be half asleep, and the mention of fairies and enchantment, which I've highlighted here, remind us of the magical qualities that this ritual is supposed to possess. Although the word enchantment also helps to further cast Porphyro as an enchanter. I mean, think again how quickly Angela goes from a state of horror at Porphyro's plan to being a willing participant in it, evidenced again by the first line of the following stanza. It's almost like she too has fallen under his spell. The final 2 lines of this stanza, which I've indicated here, are highly ambiguous, and in fact there is no agreed explanation for them. The most convincing one that I've found is credited to the critic Karen Harvey, who interprets them as part of an ongoing theme concerning the dangers of enthrallment or being under a spell. You'll almost certainly be aware of Merlin, the wizard from Arthurian legend, but his downfall comes about by falling in love with Vivian, who is also known in the legend as the Lady of the Lake. She becomes frightened that Merlin will seduce her with his spells, and so says that she will never love him unless he teaches her his magic. Merlin agrees, unaware that Vivian will use his own powers against him. Eventually, Vivian casts a spell over Merlin, places him in a magical cave so that he can never escape, thus causing his death. Karen Harvey says that the monstrous debt is the debt of his entrapment paid through the working of one of his own spells against him, which was a consequence of his enthrallment to her. So, Porphyro is the Merlin figure in this interpretation, and Madeline is the Vivian character who has enchanted him. Since we've already been told back in stanza 8 that Madeline is under the spell or hoodwinked by fairy fancy, combined with what happens at the end of the poem, both lovers represent the dangers of enthrallment. So, moving on. As I mentioned just now, stanza 20 begins with Angela agreeing to everything that Porphyro asks of her. She gives him instructions where to conceal himself, which is in a closet, where food is stored along with Madeline's lute, which is a guitar-like instrument, and a timbre frame, which is used for embroidery. We're given further evidence of Angela's age through her description of being slow, feeble and forgetful, and as a result of this there is no time to spare. She then instructs Porphyro to wait and pray before telling him that now he must marry Madeline, and this is almost certainly because she knows Porphyro's true intentions. So, Angela leaves, presumably to check that the path to Madeline's bedroom is clear before returning and telling Porphyro to follow her. We can see Angela's worry in this stanza through the words fear, aghast and fright. She's afraid of being spotted with Porphyro and perhaps afraid of what she is enabling. But fear gives way to security through the use of this caesura, and now they are safe at last in Madeline's bedroom. 3 adjectives are used to describe the bedroom which appear to almost personify it, and certainly the use of the word chaste tells us more about Madeline's virginity than the room. Porphyro hides and feels pretty pleased, while Angela hurries off in a distressed state. She finds Madeline and guides her to the bedroom too. Notice the language used to describe Madeline here. She's described as a charmed maid. And then in the first of 2 similes in this stanza, she is compared to a missioned spirit. And both of this continue her associations with some otherworldly creature. The caesura here gives extra impact to the word now, as the action is brought right before our eyes and Porphyro is told to prepare for Madeline's entrance. The tension and anticipation are increased through the repetition. She comes again, as Madeline gets closer and closer to opening the door. But before that, Keats deploys the second of the 2 similes used to describe Madeline in this stanza, this time comparing her to a ring-dove frayed and fled, which characterises her as a frightened animal under considerable strain, fleeing a predator. The question of Madeline's complicity in the events of this poem is a source of ambiguity and disagreement, but here, as with earlier allusions to lambs, Madeline is a vulnerable victim, unaware of what is about to happen to her. And exactly what that is, along with the rest of this poem, is the subject of part 2 of the Eve of St Agnes.